Jeep has turned 75, and to celebrate the big birthday, I travelled to the Rocky Deserts in Utah to see exactly how this American icon has changed over the years. And it all starts with this, the Willys Overland MB. This is Genesis. This is the very first Willys Jeep, the wartime car, the Second World War superstar. So the story dates all the way back to 1941, where the US government needed a light reconnaissance vehicle, and several companies pitched for the business, including Ford and the Bantam Motor Company, and of course Willys Overland. And it was Willys Overland who won the initial contract. They built 25,000 of them in the first year. And from 1942 onwards, we started to get to the vehicle we're familiar with. So the 9-slot grille, the square fenders, the general rugged look that we're so familiar with these days. It's obviously very archaic to drive. We've got a 3-speed gearbox, a hard ride. It's noisy, loud, windy, but it's fit for purpose. By the end of the war, Jeep had built over 380,000 of them, and to a certain extent it helped the Allies win the Second World War. They were able to go out on reconnaissance and recce before sending their main tanks into battle due to this vehicle. And of course, as much as I hate to say it, if it hadn't been for this car, we may not have had the Land Rover, because of course the Land Rover was the British version of this car after the war. Now after the war, Willys trademarked the name Jeep because it was such a familiar term by that time. And of course now Jeep is a brand in itself, and of course for many people across the world, you say Jeep and they think of a 4-wheel drive vehicle. It's that important. It wasn't just having a leading role in winning the Second World War that makes the MB so important. It was the car that coined the name Jeep. Confusion reigns over the origins of the name. Some say it's the abbreviation for General Purpose, or GP, while others say it was a name coined by American GIs in reference to Eugene the Jeep, a character in Popeye cartoons. This is where the story could have ended, but luckily, for this video at least, it continued, and the next car in Jeep's history seemed very familiar. Welcome to the CJ2A, and this is where the Jeep starts to get interesting for people like you and me, because it's where Jeep started to change from a military vehicle into a civilian vehicle. In fact, the letter CJ stand for Civilian Jeep. Now, it was built between 1945 and 1949, and it became the first mass production Jeep, really. They started to sell them into the general public, and it started to have a few luxuries compared to the older Willys Jeep. So there's a spare wheel, and there's a tailgate as well for those trips shopping. We've still got a column change gearbox, and it's still very rudimentary to drive. It's quite bouncy, and you still get the open air experience just like you get on the old Willys Jeep. It's absolutely gorgeous to drive. It's so sweet and charming. I've got a steering wheel that feels like I'm steering a massive, great big ship, but the seats are nice and comfortable, and I'm bouncing along, and I'm getting images of people like John Wayne driving this car. It's hand signals, of course, no indicators here. One interesting thing about the CJ is it's got larger headlamps compared to the military Willys Jeep of the Second World War, and that's obviously to give better visibility. But this car started a Jeep trademark, a design classic, which is of course the 7-slot grille. Now the Willys Jeep had a 9-slot grille, and this one, to cope with the larger headlamps, they had to reduce the number of slots, hence why it's got 7, and from that moment onwards it became a Jeep design cue. Welcome to 1946 and to the Willys Wagon. Now, it may look a little bit archaic on the road, but it's a very important Jeep, and also a very important car generally, because it could be argued this is the world's first sports utility vehicle. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's a 7-seater, 6 of the seats can be removed so it can be like a van, and it was also quite small for an American car, so it could thread its way through city streets and find a parking spot outside the grocery store. Now, it was built between 1946 and 1965, but the most important year was 1949 because this car gained four-wheel drive. Now, it's the first car of its kind to have four-wheel drive. Before that, military vehicles like the Willys Jeep had only used four-wheel drive, but this really marked a changing point. And so it became the world's first SUV with four-wheel drive, according to Jeep, and it really became the forerunner to the Grand Wagoneer and cars like the Grand Cherokee we have today. Its horn is also fantastic. Listen to this. Lovely. So 1940s, isn't it? This is the Jeep CJ5, and it's a very important moment in Jeep's history because when this car first arrived in 1955, it marked a big change in Jeep. Before then, Jeeps had been very much utility vehicles, but from this model onwards, Jeeps started to become known as lifestyle recreational vehicles. Cars that you take out for the joy of driving. Now, when production ended in 1983, it became Jeep's longest built car. They built thousands of them, and it became very popular with young people because here was a car that people could aspire to owning, to driving at the weekends and having fun with their friends. One key difference between this car and the two models before it was it started to become a lot easier to drive. The steering's a lot more direct, the gearbox is a lot easier to use, and the suspension is a lot more comfortable. This car also marks an important change in the way Jeeps looked. Up until this point, they were very square and utilitarian-like, but now they start to be a little bit more rounded. If you think this car looks a little bit familiar, you're probably right, because it was the Jeep that was first used in the Korean Wars and was adapted to road use. They built more than 600,000 of them. It was that popular. Come the mid-1980s, things started to change at Jeep. This is the Grand Wagoneer, and as its name suggests, it's grand. It's a step up from all the other cars that we've driven so far. Much like Land Rover was doing with the Range Rover, Jeep wanted to attract a new type of customer to the brand. So we've got soft leather seats, we've got a wooden dash, and we've got a smooth 5.9 litre V8 engine under the bonnet. And as such, the Granddaddy, as the Grand Wagoneer was nicknamed, started to attract celebrities to the brand, something Jeep had never experienced before. This is where things start to get a little bit more familiar, because this is the Cherokee from 1984 all the way up to 2001. And I say familiar because it's probably the first Jeep in the UK that most people would be familiar with. That's largely because it was the first proper Jeep to be sold in the UK, and it's sold by the bucket load. It very much epitomised the small premium SUV sector. It dominated it for 18 years around the world, and Jeep sold hundreds of thousands of them. Now, it was quite an important Jeep for many reasons, the first of which was the fact it was the first Jeep to have a unibody construction. In other words, it had a monocoque construction, so the whole body and chassis were one. There's also a vast array of petrol and diesel engines, and in the UK people really took it to its heart. Now, one of the big advantages of having that unibody construction was the fact that it was much lighter than having a separate chassis. It was also just as strong as a car with a conventional chassis as well, and it really paved the way for SUVs that we still buy to this day. This car has also become a bit of a design classic, almost in the same vein as the original Range Rover. That boxy shape has become so recognisable. In here it's a little bit dated. I must admit the square edge dashboard looks a little bit old hat, and to drive it feels just a little bit slushy, but overall it still feels surprisingly modern. This car also had a bit of a scary reputation. Speak to an owner who drove one of these back in the day and they probably would tell you of slippery conditions around roundabouts. It did like to lose its back end at the drop of a hat in two-wheel drive mode. This is where the Jeep story starts to get really modern, because this is the Grand Cherokee from 1993, and it's a car you really will be very familiar with because it's not that long ago since they stopped making them. They're still a fairly familiar sight on UK roads. Now, this car really did start to epitomise the premium SUV sector of the 1990s. It was comfortable, it had a switchable automatic four-wheel drive system, something quite unheard of in its today, and it could still go to the shops with a big boot, and it could still climb many mountains because, of course, it was a Jeep. It was also state-of-the-art for a Jeep because it was the first Jeep to have a driver's side airbag. And it was also made out of 90% recycled materials, and you can probably tell because it's full of cheap plastic in here. But most importantly of all, it sold over 1 million in 4 years, something that was really quite unheard of, even for a Jeep. Jeep couldn't be in a more different place 75 years on from the World War II MB. Its range will boast a Nissan Qashqai rival in 2017, and there's a new Wrangler on the way, along with a brand new, full-size SUV that will bring back the Grand Wagoneer name. There's even going to be a pickup by 2020. An exciting new phase is about to start. Happy birthday, Jeep! Click the video windows to watch first drives of the Jeep Renegade and Cherokee, and on the play icon for our latest video, and on our logo to subscribe.